Norma Kamali.
Right.
Well, not quite that long. About 1970. I don't know, when was Studio 54? 74, 6? Yeah, right. Right. I was a fan. I met a very cute guy. I married him 3 months after I met him, Richard Robinson, my late husband. We were married for 49 years. He opened a door, turned over a column he was writing in an English tiny music magazine, newspaper actually, and said, "You do it. I don't want to do it anymore." And I said, "I don't know how to write." He said, "Yes, you do. You know how to talk. You can write." And I certainly knew how to talk. And I just started writing in England about bands like Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones. And then I met Mick Jagger backstage at a concert. I had already been on tour with Led Zeppelin because they wanted some good publicity and they weren't getting any. And I loved them. And all the boys writing about rock and roll then thought they were a cheesy heavy metal band. I thought they were majestic. I gave them some good press in England. Their parents read it. They were thrilled. So I went on 5 tours with them. And then I met Mick Jagger at a concert backstage. And when I first met him, Mick was always my barometer of the way people acted around him because he took all the air with like all the air in the room. He walked in, it was all on him at that time. And everybody sort of panicked and acted weird and nervous. And when I met him, I just thought, those are the tackiest shoes I ever saw. They were rhinestone covered like Papagallos or something. And he cracked up and he just thought I was funny. And we just gossiped. And they took me on the 1975 Rolling Stones tour of the Americas. I was part of the entourage. And then everything started falling into place. Because when you got their seal of approval at that time, everybody wanted to talk to me. I had a syndicated column. I had a syndicated radio show. I was writing for the New York Post for a long time. And Richard, my husband, and I were editing rock magazines. So my interviews were just chatty, gossipy, behind the scenes, backstage stuff. And that was a big relief for all those guys. They mostly were guys then, except for, someone like a national treasure such as Tina Turner, who I also spent a lot of time with. But yeah, I have 5,000 digitized hours of audio interviews and on 4 or 5 external hard drives for safekeeping, 5 storage spaces with thousands and thousands of photos of mostly me with musicians because our rock magazines became shameless self-promotional tools, really. And yeah, it just kept going until then I was going to write a book in 1999. I decided to go to Vanity Fair instead. I've been there for about 25 years now and 24 years. And I did a lot of wonderful music portfolios with Annie Leibovitz and music issues, and interviewed Beyonce and Jay-Z and Lady Gaga and Adele and Jennifer Lopez and very young Justin Bieber and Lizzo last summer. And, so I've still kind of kept this going. Yes. Peter Grant. Yeah, Peter Grant was the manager of Led Zeppelin. And the first time I ever met him, I went to see the band in Jacksonville, Florida. And I was scared to go because I kept hearing that they were raping and pillaging their way across the world, or America anyway, while their wives were home in England. And no, they weren't raping, but they were wild. And it was a wild scene in the 70s. And I was nervous, but I went. They were absolute. I think here's the difference. The minute I met them, I started talking about music. I was talking about the blues and Elmore James and Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Fairport Convention and Joni Mitchell and the Incredible String Band. And so they knew I knew about the music that influenced them because we were all sort of the same generation. And that gave me a whole different access to them. So they were total sweethearts and gentlemen to me. Peter Grant was backstage in Jacksonville screaming his head off about some bootleg t-shirts that were being sold outside of the venue. So that was my first introduction to him, and he was frightening. He was very, very large, very sort of East End, English, very much like that espresso bongo scene of rock and roll in the 60s in England. And he had rumored once to be holding someone outside of a window by their shoes, by their feet. And so, of course, I was scared of him. He was an absolute sweetheart, a gentleman and an angel to me, always. Oh, I know. Yes. Well, yes, of course. Also, it was the same with the Stones because we all kind of grew up on the black blues music. And to me, Keith Richards, I mean, Jimmy was a virtuoso. He was like Jimi Hendrix, Jimmy Page. But Keith Richards, just the feel of his guitar to me was just the most moving and special in rock and roll. But it was interesting because I never reviewed bands. I never wrote about their albums. I never reviewed the concerts. But I probably knew a lot more about the music than a lot of these boys that were reviewing their albums and giving Zeppelin the worst reviews of all time. I mean, Jimmy Page, 30 years later, would still quote some of those reviews to me. And I would always just say, forget about it. Who cares? What is people going to remember 30 years from now, that review or your record? It spoiled me a lot because I still write about music. I'm very into hip hop. That's really kind of the only music I'm listening to now. But all I have to do is hear Sunshine Bores the Daylights Out of Me from Rocks Off on the Rolling Stones album. And it just brings me back to standing backstage. And okay, that's the clue to go run for the cars. It's my youth. I mean, that was my youth. My childhood was kind of very much blues and folk music, and my parents were kind of very left wing, so we grew up with Leadbelly and Woody Guthrie and all that stuff. But so I know where all the stuff comes from, and it's interesting to me because I tell Mick Jagger now they sound like the guys they started out imitating. They're 80 and Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters played until they died. And it's kind of interesting to watch it come full circle, even with someone like Robert Plant, because I did a story with him recently last year for Vanity Fair with Alison Krauss for the record they did of bluegrass Americana. And, they've been offered $300 million or God knows how much to go reunite Zeppelin again. He doesn't want to do that. He wants to go to Nashville and go and play the music from, that he loved, just kind of bluegrass country. It's called Americana for lack of a better word, but just when you talk to people who really understand the roots of all this stuff, it's just amazing to me because then when I listen to hip hop and I hear all the samples, and to me, that's the most original music of the last 30 years. So it's all comes down to R&B and soul and black music. There was, yeah. Yeah. It's passing it on. They've always said that, passing it on. Like whoever it was, a blues guy passed it on to Eric Clapton. He passed it on to Eddie Van Halen. He passed it on to Slash of Guns N' Roses. It just like keeps going. And I've seen Keith also around Tina Turner and Ronnie Spector, and just there's tremendous respect. Yes. Hmm. Right. 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 I think it might have also been Anita Pallenberg telling him to wear that stuff. Right. You know, that's part of it. Right. Oh, yeah, no. He was very androgynous, yeah. Well, when I first started seeing pictures of him in the 60s, I mean, I was always a Stones fan more than a Beatles fan until I got to really know John Lennon, who I love dearly. Only John Lennon in that band. But I thought he was just sexy and gorgeous, without question. Never even occurred to me. Years later, I talked to him about androgyny and bisexuality, and we had very frank conversations about it, which will remain under lock and key until I sell all these archives to someone. But I did write a little bit about it in an interview I did with him and Andy Warhol's interview, where he said to me that in the 60s he found it interesting to be attractive to members of both sex. Yeah. In the 70s, of course, prior to AIDS, with David Bowie, and then, years later with Boy George, and now with Harry Styles, I mean, it's a lot the British. The British have always, my husband always used to say, it doesn't take much for a British guy to just put on a dress. I mean, it goes back to that dance hall tradition and, all of that sort of vaudevillian thing. But I mean, Ray Davies never was wearing a dress that I recall, but he did write a beautiful album called Come Dancing about that whole world. But Bowie, everybody thought it was shocking when he was the Ziggy Stardust persona. And he came to New York the first time I met him. He had very long hair and a page boy, wore a dress and yellow patent leather Mary Jane shoes. And I just have been so used to the Warhol crowd that I didn't think twice about it. But, the mainstream press was shocked. Shocked. Of course, in America also, because of the anti-Vietnam War and all of that, San Francisco with the flowers and love power and all that, flower power and all that stuff happened kind of, sometimes things are just in the air. They're sort of like in the ether and the youth really just make stuff happen. I'm worried about now because all I see is everybody looking at a phone. I don't see kids starting anything, but I always have hope that whenever anything gets really oppressive and dark and gray and bad, then stuff comes to life and an art movement forms. The interesting thing about London is after Carnaby Street and King's Road and all of that stuff in the 60s, by the beginning of the 70s, after glitter rock started, it turned black and white again. And then there was punk, and there was the Clash and the Sex Pistols, and they cut their hair, and CBGB's in New York, and black and white. So nothing lasts forever. It just always changes. Yeah. So wow, I have so many. The first time I ever met him was in England. My husband was going to do an interview with John and Yoko. I always think of it as one word, John and Yoko. And it was at Apple offices. And I don't know if they were stoned or what was it, or Richard wasn't as good an interviewer as I was. But I remember sitting there the whole time listening to them just pontificate about politics and Richard asking stilted questions. And I thought, if I ever get a chance to talk to him, this is not going to come out like this. And then Bob Gruen called me one day. He's a photographer who was very close with them. They were living on Bank Street. They came to New York. And he said, Yoko has an album and she wants to do an interview with a woman. And I was probably the only woman doing interviews with musicians then. So I went to Bank Street and I sat there and I talked to Yoko about her album for about an hour and a half. I had listened to the whole however many songs there were, 20 something. And we had a really good conversation about women and women's liberation and all of that. And then she kind of brought John back out afterwards, as I said, like dessert, like from the back room. And we just sat and just gossiped. He wanted to know dirt about David Bowie and Mick Jagger and Brian Ferry. And it was like they all wanted to know about each other. And because I was friends with all of them, well, friendly, I have to qualify that a little bit because when you're a journalist, with the exception of a few people, they're not really your friends. I mean, you're friendly. And they trusted me, which was valid because I didn't ever, if something was off the record, it was off the record. But then I started to see John a lot when they moved to the Dakota. I went up there. She liked me. So that was the seal of approval. So I got to go there and talk to him. And then when they split up for a while and he moved with May to an apartment on East 50 something or 49th, 52nd, whichever it was. And I went to that apartment and talked to him there. In fact, it was after a Beatles convention. And I asked him, would you ever go to a Beatle Fest convention? And he said, I don't think so, but it's good for the family business. I like that they do it. He says, a little Rudolph Valentino, but so we laughed about that. And I said, well, I have 4 Beatles trays. And he went, I don't have a tray. So like an idiot, I messengered over a tray to him the next day. So I now only have 3. I did also tell him I had a lunchbox and a thermos. I didn't buy it as a kid because, as I said, I wasn't a Beatles fan. I was a Stones girl. But somebody gave them to me, I guess. I said, I have a lunchbox and I have a tray. And he said, I don't have that. I said, well, you're not getting that. But he was really, really funny. He would call me up on the phone and he'd go, hello, it's me, John Beatles. And I'd say, John, I don't know any other John with a Liverpool accent. Don't worry about it. He was very bitchy. He could be very bitchy and very funny and very always witty. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think, and also his love for her, he was obsessed with her, and she opened his eyes to a lot of stuff he didn't know about. And he was very, very um, respectful and very nice about women, I think, and certainly was great to me. He was great to me. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, he just wanted her with him all the time. It was that simple. And I don't think that the band was used to that. There was a very macho scene in England then. And yes, Linda McCartney was around Paul, but Yoko was literally next to him on the piano. And at one point, I remember talking to George Harrison, and because I said, I think Yoko gets such an unfair rap for breaking you guys up. I thought it was racist, it was misogynist. And he said, it's not what broke us up. He said, I didn't want to go in the studio and have Paul McCartney tell me what to play anymore. So, I think that's all been well documented since. But when he told me that in 1973 or whenever it was, and I wrote it, it was a big deal, big deal. What happened with that is that well, as far as I know, I mean, Eric talked to me about it a little bit. Patty talked about it once, I think, to me when I did an interview with her for not her book, but something. And George talked to me about it. I mean, Eric was married to her, right? Or with her or living with her. And then she left him. Yes, they were down the road. They lived down the road. They were best friends. And I think Eric maybe was on drugs. I think there was a drug issue. And Patty and George just started having an affair and fell in love. And the other way around. Okay, let's forget that. Wait, who was she? Oh, she was with George and then she fell in love with Eric. And yes, that's what happened. Okay. Oh, she's beautiful. She, oh, yeah. Yeah. Actually, Rita Coolidge wrote Layla to begin with and never got the credit for it, but that's a whole other story. Yes, she since has gotten some grudging credit. I mean, Eric wrote the lyrics, but she came with the original riff. And anyway, the thing about that is it was the 70s, 60s, then the 70s. Girls like Twiggy, Chrissy Shrimpton, Jane Birkin, Anita Pallenberg, Patty Boyd. I mean, that whole group of girls looking like that, coming out of the women's liberation era, has never been matched. I don't care. You can name 25 influencers to me today. There's nothing ever been like that. The supermodels, gorgeous, Christy, Naomi, all that, yes, great. But that was the first time. I mean, I'm not saying that women like Dovima and Susie Parker and people in the 40s, you know, for those of us who remember all that, it was different fashions create different times. This was a wild time. And girls were all sleepy. People said everybody was sleeping with everybody. Yeah. Styled. Norma, you tell me, because I remember going to discotheques wearing your miniskirts, Betsy Johnson's miniskirts, Rudy Gernreich, no bra, miniskirts, fishnet t-shirts as a dress. I mean, I was very young and very thin, and I could get away with all that. But you all came up with the same thing at the same time also. Why? How? Wait, what job at the, what were you doing at the? Oh, right. Mm. Yeah, right. Or girdles. Remember girdles? Right, I know. That's right. Oh, those were the days. Right. I know. Right. Yeah, always. It always has. Yeah, right. Right. And I have this thing about I'm such a basketball fanatic, but to me, there is such a connection now, especially with hip hop and basketball and fashion and people. And MTV also changed it again in the 80s because you could start to see all these videos. I'm not sure that it was a good thing because all these major budgets to make these massive little movies that were supposed to tell you what the music sounded like as opposed to you lying on your floor smoking a joint imagining what the music was about. But the music and the fashion intrinsically has always been connected without question. And those girls, to get back to that point, were sleeping with those guys because those were the prettiest girls in London and those were the most famous guys. And the same thing happened in Laurel Canyon in the 70s because I did an oral history of Laurel Canyon for Vanity Fair. And I spoke to Joni Mitchell and Judy Collins and Linda Ronstadt and, the guys from the Eagles and Crosby, Stills, Nash and all of them. And they all were sleeping with each other. I mean, so it wasn't so much, they took drugs together, they made music together, and they slept together. It was a scene. There was the same thing in New York in the 70s with the whole CBGB scene. Scenes aren't always meant to last, but when they happen, they can change the world. Sometimes this stuff comes up from the streets and people don't always get the proper credit for it. It's the person who takes it out to the masses who gets the credit. You have been ripped off, let's not go there, but by so many people of stuff you did decades before other people decided to do a puffy jacket or, you know. Well, yeah, artists have always had this issue of any kind, but also I think a lot of stuff, I don't know what's going to happen with AI, but certainly with the internet and certainly everything being accessible to everybody, certainly did get an awful lot of mediocre people taking stuff from more talented and often underappreciated people. And I mean, I know photographers and designers and musicians who got famous after they died. I mean, we all know those. And it's tragic in one way, but on the other hand, you know, ultimately, I think the really good stuff rises to the top. And lasts. I mean, I remember having fights with so many, not fights, but arguments with musicians who were bitching about a record company president and something that, and they weren't doing enough for them and this and that. And, you know, whether it was Lou Reed or the Black Crowes or whoever. And I always used to say to them, who was the president of Mercury Records in 1974? And they'd say, oh, I don't know. What difference does it make? And I'd say, well, do you remember that man? Or do you remember Rod Stewart's Every Picture Tells a Story? I mean, because that's the truth. I mean, the work lasts. The talent, the art, the work, I am optimistic that it lasts. I mean, I am, unfortunately, a hoarder, or you could say an archivist, or you could just say I never threw anything out. I mean, I have every note I ever took from every Led Zeppelin concert I ever went to on pink Beverly Hills Hotel little pads, in envelopes with the dates marked on them, in boxes and boxes and boxes, 5 storage spaces. You come to my apartment, it's a museum. I mean, when you told me you divested yourself of stuff, I got so inspired, and I started talking to people. Come and buy my 8,000 LPs. Come and take books. I've got 10,000 books. I have 5 storage spaces. I have all this stuff, and I'm still living with all this stuff. I can't either, but that's another, yeah. I hope it's during in my lifetime. Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that the positive thing about all of this is the fact that women are, you know, finally at the top of the game concert-wise, whether it's Taylor Swift or Beyonce or Adele or Lady Gaga, prior to who I love. Megan Thee Stallion, Rihanna, you know, Dua Lipa. I mean, Rihanna's more famous now for her lingerie and her skincare line, but yeah, but she's so sexy. Rihanna, I think she's so sexy. And she's a sweetheart and so elegant. Beyonce, I think it's very easy to understand. First of all, she's a lovely girl. And second of all, she works harder than anybody on the planet, I think. But she also represents something to young Black women on a very mass popular level as a pop star, but she can do anything. She can rap, she can sing R&B, she can dance. She's kind of the whole package. She's sort of a representation to a whole culture that, in a way, Michael Jackson was. And it's not just because she's Black, it's because she's adorable. And yeah, and the thing is, I think that Adele, of course, who's got an amazing killer voice, um, these women have fan bases now that were not possible before the internet, before social media, before being able to be on everybody's phone and everybody's house. Well, first it was MTV with everybody's house. Now it's in palm of your hand. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And I also think in the terms of like even Taylor Swift, it's teenage girls, they have somebody they identify with. 11, I think, to 17 is the demographic of most of them. I do think that a lot of these girls grow out of them. It's like we look at boy bands, NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, BTS, all of those boy bands, One Direction. Clearly, Harry Styles was always going to be the biggest star coming out of that band. Justin Timberlake was always going to be the biggest star coming out of NSYNC. Beyonce was going to be the biggest star coming out of Destiny's Child. Taylor Swift wasn't going to stay in Nashville for long. It's just very clear what happens when people are ambitious and they work hard and they make music that appeals to millions of people. And they just don't stop. They're driven. Madonna's in her 60s, so she still wants to perform. She's still driven. The Stones putting out a new record, and they may tour again in the 80s. I mean, well, first of all, I'm not sure everybody thought that we were all going to live this long. The lifespan has changed with better medicines and wellness and everything else that everybody does to take care of themselves. But also, I just think that, you just don't know what's going to happen. You can't predict. I mean, I've learned that I could see Billy Joel when he played the piano in a little tiny bar on the east side of Manhattan called JP's in the 70s, and there were 3 people in the room, and I knew he'd be a big star. I met Michael Jackson when he was 12, and I was in Encino, and there's a picture in one of my books of that, and I also posted it on the dreaded Instagram, but it's like I called my best friend that day, and I said, this kid's going to be the greatest entertainer in the world. And she said, how can you tell he's 12? I said, I can tell. Sometimes you know. Oh, yeah. Beyonce used to watch videos of the Supremes again and again and again. And in her concert, I think it was in LA, maybe on her birthday, September 4th this past year, everybody went to see her show. There's tons of people Kardashians, Meghan Markle, all these people backstage at her show are posing for their own Instagram. The only person that Beyonce took a picture with was Diana Ross when she came on stage to sing Happy Birthday to Beyonce. Yes. And the thing is, Beyonce told me in one of the times I interviewed her that that was just her idea of glamour and poise and elegance. And she watched those tapes over, VHS tapes her father showed her of Motown. And when I did my oral history of Motown for Vanity Fair, I talked to everybody about everybody. And I had talked to Michael so many times in his life. In fact, when he was here doing The Wiz, I took him to Studio 54 one night, and I have funny pictures of me and him on the sofa, the silver sofa. And Frank Leibowitz thinks she danced with him there that night, but I don't remember. Yeah, I mean, I remember pretty much everything, but I'm not sure about that. But then again, I used to drink a lot when I went to Studio 54. I never took drugs, actually. That's another reason. I think that I have a kind of longevity in this world. I never slept with the musicians. I never took drugs. It was always incredibly important for me. First of all, I was married to a guy who was much cuter than they were. And I also did not want to be ever perceived as some groupie. It was very important to me that I was very professional. And also, a lot of these guys came from farms in England, and I thought they were hicks. You know, I'm from New York City. Me too. Well, yeah, I mean, what happened at Motown, because I've spent about 80 hours talking to Berry Gordy and Suzanne DePass and Diana, everybody, Berry Gordy came from Detroit. And he thought he would start a music company that would be like the Ford Motor Company where he had worked. You know, you just like sort of churn out these records like on an assembly line. However, all these kids, Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, The Temptations, the Four Tops, they all lived around the same area, and they all wanted to be signed to Motown once he had his first hit, which was Money. And then Smokey Robinson had the other big hit, I think Tears of a Clown or one of those. And it was the first Black owned record company. But the music got on the radio. Barry used to start out his albums by putting white people on the cover, and people didn't know that they were all Black musicians on radio stations that would not play Black music. And it crossed over. So it was the first music that really crossed over. I mean, if you heard Baby Love on the radio, it didn't sound like anything else. And the thing is, Berry was so smart. He hired Charlie Atkins, who was a choreographer, to teach them how to dance. He hired a woman, Maxine Powell, who I interviewed at length, to teach them etiquette, how to walk, how to talk, how to wear white gloves. And she said to me, she's dead, but she was alive when I talked to her, and she said, I had to teach them etiquette, and I told the Supremes, they always used to say to me, we just want a hit record. And I used to say, no, you have to know which fork to use because you're going to be having dinner with kings and queens. And that is exactly what happened. You know, the Supremes went to England, the Beatles welcomed them. They did eventually meet Queen Elizabeth. And Diana Ross was always dressed to the nines. I mean, she was so elegant and so just glamorous, glamorous. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I love Donna Summer. Donna was great. I mean, Donna, the interesting thing is that whole record, Love to Love You Baby, started because our mutual friend, the late Neil Bogart, had been at a party and he heard Serge Gainsbourg and Jane Birkin's Je t'aime, which was an orgasmic kind of long French dance song. And people kept saying, play it again, play it again, play it again. And he thought, if I could do a 20-minute version of something like this, I'll have a hit. And Donna was in Germany with Giorgio Moroder, and she was recording, and they told her they wanted her to record this song like that with this kind of orgasmic breathing and everything. And Donna said, she was a church going girl and she was a prude. I think she had been abused by a pastor or something. There's some ugly story in her past, but she nonetheless didn't want to do this. And so she told me, and this has since been well documented in her documentaries and everything, that she had to lie down on the floor, have candles lit, turn the lights off, and then do the song. And then, of course, the minute it started playing in discos and clubs, it was a massive hit. Yeah, from that image. I know. I know. Right. Religious, religious. Yeah, I know. You mean clothes? Yeah, yeah, I know. Oh, so many of them are like that. But with her, I know. And when I interviewed her, kind of towards the end of her life, I did an oral history of disco for Vanity Fair. And I spoke to her at length. She was living in Nashville with Bruce, her husband, and her children. And she told me she had to leave LA because she couldn't stand seeing men on the street exposing themselves. I said, what? Who's on the street exposing themselves? I mean, I grew up going to school in the Bronx on the subway and seeing that, but I wasn't aware that this was a streetwise problem in Los Angeles. But she said, I can't bring my children up in that city. That's a sinful city. And then she moved to Nashville, and that's when we spent a lot of time talking. But she was so down to earth and so smart, really smart. Yes. Yeah. I mean, if I hear any of those disco songs now, even the one hit wonders like whatever, Ring My Bell, or, I mean, I heard Hollywood swinging the other night in a restaurant and I thought, oh, wow. And I still feel like dancing. Yeah. Yes. Same with Motown. Motown, yeah, Motown also. You hear those songs if you grew up to it, and it just like brings you back to a time. But to me, the most interesting thing about Motown, and I've told this to Berry Gordy, that I felt he was an incredibly important person in the civil rights movement. Because since the music crossed over, people like at first, he said he used to get letters saying, "We're not playing your music," and parents wouldn't let their kids listen to it. And the Temptations told me when they first went out on tour, there was a rope in the middle of the audience. Black kids had to sit on one side, white kids had to sit on the other. And by the end of their tour, the rope was gone and everybody was dancing together. I mean, listen, I had to listen to stories from Tina Turner for years about Ike before she even wrote about it, about getting beaten up and all of that. And I had to hear about Martha Reeves telling me when they played the Chitlin circuit, they didn't have proper dressing rooms. They had to cook food on the radiators. I mean, when you think of all the things that people went through, yeah. I mean, it's heartbreaking and sickening. But you know what's interesting to me? Because we asked about John Lennon before and we were just talking about Beyonce, and it just reminded me of something she told me that the first time her parents ever heard her sing, they didn't know she could really sing in public, was at a talent show at her school, and she sang Imagine. She sang John Lennon's Imagine. That was her song. She said, that was my song. And Miss Tina, her mother, told me, was that my child? I didn't know she could sing like that. But then she started doing beauty pageants, and then her mother pulled her out of the beauty pageants. But yeah, I mean, there's just that's the thing that unites people. I mean, when you think of like a 7-year-old Beyonce or however old she was singing John Lennon's Imagine, music really brings the world together. Yeah. Aretha? Marilyn Monroe. I mean, well, I never really, I knew Whitney. I spoke to her a few times. I never really properly interviewed her because she was always kept very distant. But I've talked to enough female musicians, particularly ones who've had big drug problems, Stevie Nicks, um, others who've talked about it. And I think there's a lot going on. First of all, a lot of them very insecure, but they're fine when they get on a stage. But the self doubts the rejection, the stuff that happened with their families, with them as children, that doesn't matter. You don't separate that just because they have a big talent. Also, they're on the road. They can't fall asleep after a show. Someone gives them a pill, says, go to sleep, you can take this. Then they get up in the morning, they're groggy. Or in Bonnie Raitt's case, she started to drink in the morning and they just get hooked on this stuff. And it's that vicious cycle of stay up, go down, stay up, get down. And also when people get famous, all sorts of people come crawling out of the woodwork willing to just give them stuff. I mean, there are certain people who are completely immune to it. Beyonce, I would assume Taylor Swift. I know Adele. I mean, these girls don't take drugs. But there are others who are immensely talented. I mean, Stevie Nicks, Gaga's had drug issues, all these women, especially women, but a lot of guys too. I mean, look, Prince, Michael Jackson, many, many great talents have died. Michael Hutchins, Chris Cornell. I mean, the list is endless. But in terms of the women, which is what I'm interested in terms of the drugs and the insecurity and the sleepless nights and the bad love affairs and the bad business decisions, which is why I wrote a book called Nobody Ever Asked Me About the Girls, because nobody did. And then I really went into a deep dive on it. And these women have told me, the guys in my band after a show could go out with their whores, but I had to go back to my room alone. And the only one who ever told me, actually, she went back to her room and read a book was Linda Ronstadt, I think. And it's so tragic what happened to her. I mean, Linda was misdiagnosed with Lyme disease and she has Parkinson's and she can't sing anymore. I mean, that's the tragedy of that. Joni Mitchell had a horrible, horrible stroke and was in a home for 2 years, unable to talk, and then is pulling herself back up. Talk about the grit of that woman. But I talked to her a lot about drugs, and she said, no, I never was really a druggie. Cigarettes and coffee, that was my poison. So. Delta blues, yeah. Suffering, pain. You connect with it, yeah. This is when he was alive or before? Yeah. Yeah. It's so weird because I am a white Jewish woman from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, but I always connected with Black gospel music and blues. Somehow it's just so emotional. It's so powerful. It just gets to you. It's like, I can hear Mavis Staples or Mahalia Jackson, or I mean, I can't even begin. There's so many wonderful Sister Rosetta Tharpe. That music would just make me cry. Yeah. It's powerful, emotional, spiritual music. It is. And I'm not really spiritual, but that music is the closest I get to it. I once was driven on Highway 61 from New Orleans, no, wait, from Nashville all the way down to New Orleans, then through Clarksdale, Mississippi, or I may be getting the geography wrong, but then ending up in Austin, Texas. And somebody said to me, it's a psychedelic ride. You're going to pass where Robert Johnson made his pact with the devil on the crossroads, and you're just going to feel like you're on another planet. And so I specifically played tapes in the car of Alan Lomax's Sound of the South, which was spirituals and blues and slave chants and all sorts of. And it really was, I felt like I was tripping. I mean, I took LSD once in my life, and it felt, that drive felt like that. And then when I got to Austin, there was a club called Antone's, which was a blues club, and Hubert Sumlin, who was Howlin' Wolf's guitar player, and Pinetop Perkins, who was Muddy Waters' piano player, and they were still alive at the time, and they were performing every night, and I would go to the back room of their dressing room and sit and just listen to them tell stories. And it was just to hear these old guys talk. And I was lucky enough at Vanity Fair early on to have Annie Leibovitz be able to photograph all these guys. We just found them, we photographed them. And at the same time, I could listen to the Bad Brains, who were like a reggae punk rock band from Washington, D.C., and be totally taken away by them. So my taste kind of covers the waterfront. Yeah. I know, me too. I know. No, I never have music on when I write. No. Oh, concentrate. Right. I understand that. I know. To silence? No. No, I understand it completely. I never have music on when I write. Oh, they don't get it. You don't even bother explaining it. Oh my God. I don't really have one. I mean, the only time I ever did karaoke in my life, to be honest, was John McEnroe's house at the top of the building where he has a tower apartment. It's 360-degree view of Manhattan. And I was quite drunk, and his daughter and I did 99 Problems, Jay-Z's 99 Problems. But other than that, I don't. My best friend, Fran Lebowitz, will tell you I have a very good singing voice. And I used to have a very good singing voice. I can't hit the notes now. But the songs that I would sing are standards, jazz, Chris Connor, Anita O'Day, Sarah Vaughan, but only around my house, only to like one or two people. I never sang publicly, except at my bat mitzvah. And I was one of the first girls in New York to ever get bat mitzvah. But no, I don't, I really haven't been to a lot of karaoke bars. No. Yes. Laughing, certainly. Yes. No, no, not in front of me. No. um, Well, they listened to classical music, WQXR, every weekend. But I also think we had a lot of sort of left wing Woody Guthrie kind of folk music in the house. So I was exposed to that kind of music and lead belly and blues stuff at a very early age. But I also snuck out of my house at the age of 12 to go down to the village to see Thelonious Monk, Miles Davis, all of those jazz guys. I mean, John Coltrane. Yeah, I looked ridiculous. The more I think about it, I used to palm my hair up in a bun on the top of my head. I would wear sheath dresses, sleeveless, with high heels, put on makeup, tottering into these places. I don't know how I got in, and I must have looked silly, but I got in. And yeah, Five Spot, Village Vanguard, like that. Then I also would go to the rock and roll shows, the Brooklyn Fox, those kind of shows. And I just, the minute I heard, I think it was Elvis Presley, that first album with the pink and the green and the one the Clash copied later, that's probably one of the first records that ever got me out of the house. Yeah, I just knew I used to listen to jazz under the covers on a transistor radio, and I just knew there's something else out there. Even though I came from a very liberal house with, fairly intellectual parents, and I didn't go to private schools, but and I hated school, but we had a lot of books in the house, and I had a pretty good childhood, and sort of it was enriched by music and books and like that. And I went to the movies every weekend down to Lowe's 83rd Street. But I also knew there was something else out there, something bigger. And I guess starting out with Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones was the beginning of that trip. Joey D and the Starlighters, yeah. And Jackie Kennedy was doing the twist, right? Yes. Did they pay you?
Wait.
No. That's fantastic. Yes, I know. No. The Shindig and the Tammy Show, and that was it. And Dick Clark's American Bandstand, right? Right, right, right. Yep. Yeah, me too. I mean, aren't you? I'm glad that I grew up then because I just think that I had everything available to me. I didn't have the internet. I didn't have that phone. I didn't have social media, but I had life and I had experiences and I could see people close up. I mean, Jackie Wilson told me once when I interviewed him that when he played the Apollo, he said you had to be good because half the people in the audience was better than they were. And Michael Jackson stood in the wings as a child when he was with the Jackson Five watching Jackie Wilson. I mean, watching him perform, watching James Brown, that's where he got all those moves from. So happy that there's someone else who knows who Jackie Wilson still is. Yeah. Well, musicians do. All the musicians still do. Oh, yeah. Uh huh. Wait, are we talking about Jackie Wilson or Jimmy? Yeah. Yeah, and James Brown stole that. Yeah. I'm sure you're right. Yes. Mm. Mm. Yeah, I never interviewed him, thank God, something before my time. But I did love that first record, but I didn't really pay attention to what he looked like or anything. I just thought he sounded black. I love that music. It totally resonated with me. And then when he got sort of in the Vegas period in 1972 and he was getting fat, he played at Madison Square Garden. And I remember David Bowie flew over to. David wasn't flying. I knew David from a year before that. And my husband was working at RCA, and Elvis was signed to RCA, and David got signed to RCA. And David wasn't flying for like a year or so. He was scared to fly. But he flew to New York to see Elvis Presley at the Garden. And Richard and I went to see him that night. And I thought, okay, this is too Vegasy for me. To me, it was like Wayne Newton or something. Yeah, but then, and I didn't even see the movie Elvis because I'm not a big fan of Baz Luhrmann's movies, but besides that, I just wasn't that interested. I didn't care about Austin Butler. And then one night I was looking at video on demand and I thought, okay, I'll just watch this. And I watched the movie and I saw the whole thing and I thought, okay, it's all right. And then at the end, you see Elvis Presley, fat, sweating, practically at the end of his life, the real Elvis Presley singing 4 minutes of Unchained Melody, I think. And that 4 minutes was better than the whole movie. And also it made me think like, I get it. He really cared about this music. He really grew up on Black music, on gospel, on church, on blues. And, so I had a different appreciation for it, but I can't say I ever listened to a lot of his stuff. Oh, yeah. Yeah, Joan's great. It's hilarious. Exactly. Me too. Same thing. Same sizes or different sizes? Oh my God. I adored Frank Sinatra. I mean, again, that's another music I grew up to, not in my house, but I had a best friend whose parents would listen to Frank Sinatra. So all the 1950s Capitol records I would listen to. And when I worked at Interview Magazine, I would do interviews for them. And Andy wanted me to interview Frank Sinatra, Andy Warhol. And like an idiot, I was so young and so stupid. And Frank Sinatra's publicist said, Frank needs to see the questions first. So I, being an asshole, said, oh no, I won't do that. Like, so stupid. I should have done anything to get in the room. I know. I thought that's not journalist integrity, blah, blah, blah. I'm not telling him. And Andy said, no, don't show him the questions first. And so we never did the interview. It broke I kicked myself to this day. However, when I was at the Post, I once wrote a column about all the rock and roll musicians who loved Sinatra. And he wrote me a letter because he had famously hated rock and roll because it kind of put him out of business for a minute. And I mean, not really, but and he wrote me a letter saying, what a wonderful thing you have done. This is so great. I love this column. I had no idea these. Anytime you want to see me in New York, call Bobby Marks, blah, 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 blah. And I got tickets to every single one of his concerts for the rest of his life. I just loved him. I love that voice. That phrasing is so brilliant. And I was once backstage at Radio City for one of the Grammys, I think, and Bono was giving him a Lifetime Achievement Award because Bono, of course, had met him. He met him once in Las Vegas because U2 went to see Sinatra. And Sinatra introduced them from the stage. And he said something like, this is the #1 rock group in the world. They certainly don't spend their money on their wardrobe. And then Bono went to his house, and I said to him, you have to describe the house to me in Palm Springs. I want to know everything about it. And he said, I'll tell you one day. He still hasn't. But at any rate, I was backstage. I never forgot this. Cindy Adams, U2's manager at the time, Paul McGuinness, myself, Bono. Bono made this long, flowery speech about he's the Empire State Building, he's the Statue of Liberty, typical Bono. And he gave this award to Frank Sinatra, Lifetime Achievement. And Frank was starting to lose it a little bit by then. So he kind of came out and mumbled, and he was not really coherent. And I remember Cindy saying, get him off, someone get him off. But he came backstage and he looked at his wife with this pointed glass award, and he said, you could really give someone a knock on the head with this thing. And I just thought that was the only time I really met him. Um, right. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Knew how to connect to an audience. Yeah. Oh, you did? Directly to you. Yes. No, his phrasing, his command of a lyric and the songs, and he always would say who wrote the songs, which I loved. That's what I thought was great.
Well, I think you and I could talk forever.
Days.
And ever. And I love our friendship, and I love that we have history together that is shared through our lives. And so I think what we'll do is we're going to do episodes of our little chitter tatter.
Perfect.
How's that?
That's great.
There
and
we
I'm
go.
honored to be doing this with you, Norma, because I have such a high regard for you. You're really one of the greats, and it's a pleasure. And I love talking to you. We could just gossip for hours and days. You know that.
So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
We will break this up into really cool segments.
Good.
And they'll be hearing from us again soon on something, I'm sure.
Anytime.
Okay.
I'm all yours. Thank you. Love you too.
Lisa.
Thank you, Norma.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, press follow and leave a comment after you listen to the podcast. Thanks.